I like to think of the Friedmans as a typical libertarian family. In 3 generations, they've gone from minarchist to anarchist to a platform in the middle of the ocean. But seriously, like his family, David is a man of the intellectual frontier. I'm so pleased to have him here at PorcFest X. Ladies and gentlemen, David Friedman. The
problem we are left with is what my poor grandson is going to do. I want to start by talking about a problem that libertarians and classical liberals face, to which I'm going to offer a solution that will not surprise you. And the problem is that they believe that government is a very bad way of producing cars or food, and thus that the solution to how we have a functioning society is a private market arrangement in which people deal with each other, buy and sell, contract, hire, and so forth, under a set of laws which define property rights, enforce them, and so forth. A set of laws which are designed to create a free market. And there is a problem with this answer, and the problem is that this set of laws is being created by the government. And if the government is not competent to grow food or build cars, why do you think it is competent to design and run a legal system? That, as any of you who've actually studied law will realize, designing a legal system is not a trivial problem. It may even be harder than designing an automobile. Real legal systems have to face a whole lot of complications that people who are doing libertarian philosophy don't have to worry about. Under what circumstances, when it's ambiguous who is in the right or what the obligations are, how do you settle them? So that raises the question, does the government have an incentive to make good law? And once you realize that it probably doesn't, that gets you to the question, could you construct a set of institutions where the incentives for creating good law were similar to the incentives for creating good food and good automobiles in a free market? Democracy doesn't seem to meet that requirement very well. We've done that experiment. My favorite example of the evidence that democracy does not do a good job of producing laws is the example of tariffs, of taxes on imports. It was a well-accepted 18th century doctrine that the way a country got rich was to export more than it imported. This was one central element of what was called mercantilism. This position was persuasively attacked by Adam Smith in 1776 and utterly demolished by David Ricardo about 40 years later, when Ricardo worked out what is still regarded as the correct economic analysis of foreign trade, something called the principle of comparative advantage, which I won't try to explain at the moment. So it has been about 200 years since there was a defensible economic argument to show that a country was better off with tariffs. And during that period of time, offhand, I can only think of 2 places, one of them not a country, that actually had free trade. England in the 19th century and Hong Kong in the 20th century. They were both spectacularly successful economies. Hong Kong went from being dirt poor and 10 times as densely populated as the most densely populated country in the world to being richer than England. And it did it in about 30 years. Nonetheless, you observe that the U.S. still has tariffs, that essentially all countries have tariffs. This suggests that whatever is generating the laws, it is not a mechanism for getting the right laws, the laws that make the population as well off as possible. So my answer to the question is probably pretty obvious to you. I've got the problem this evening that I don't really like preaching to the converted, and probably too many people in the audience already agree with me, which is always a problem. Not a problem I have very often, I should say. But the obvious solution is to create a system in which law itself is generated on the free market. And that's the system that I'm going to be describing, along with what seems to me to be both an economic analysis of why it would work and some reasons why it might not work, or at least some problems that it will raise. So let me start with what I think of as the easy problem. And the easy problem is enforcing a contract between two parties who are long-term repeat dealers. All right, so we're going to engage in some joint activity for many years into the future. Each of us knows that he's better off with the cooperation. And you then have what's sometimes referred to as the discipline of constant dealings. The fact that if I double-cross you today, you are going to stop trusting me, our cooperation will break down, and I'll be worse off. So in the case of long-term repeat players, it looks as though you don't need any external enforcement in order to make people keep their contracts. Right? And I want to claim that I can leverage that very simple example to solve the more general problem of how everybody interacts with everybody in a legal system without a government. So let me start out by imagining the following system. There are firms that we will call rights enforcement agencies, which sell the service of protecting the rights of their customers and settling disputes their customers have with other people. So you are a customer of such a firm, and essentially everybody is the customer of one such firm. Now, the firms now have a problem that is obvious to everybody you describe this to from Ayn Rand on down, which is why they all tell you it can't work. And the problem is what happens when I come home, my television set is missing from my living room, and the camera that my firm installed in my living room to deal with such matters shows a picture of my friend Mike Humer walking out the door with my television set. And so my rights enforcement agency calls up Mike and says, please return Friedman's television set, and by the way, you owe us $15 for our time and trouble in recovering it. And Mike says, what are you talking about? It's true I have a nice television set. Friend of mine gave it to me, but I didn't steal it from anybody. Go away. And my firm says, well, we're sorry that you are taking it this way, but unless you can convince us that it's not the television set that Professor Friedman has lost, 3 big tough guys are going to show up at your front door tomorrow morning to retrieve the television set. And Mike says, well, that's very nice, but you know, I have a rights enforcement agency too. And I'm going to call them up and tell them that I'm expecting 3 thugs to come to my front door tomorrow morning, and with luck, they'll send 4 tough guys to defend me, and what'll happen? And then everybody says, this system breaks down, it all turns into violence and war. And that's not the right answer. And the reason it's not the right answer is that these are profit-making firms, and violence is very expensive. If the way they settle their disputes is to fight each other, first they're going to have to pay hazard pay to their people, and second, they are not going to be able to deliver the service that they're selling, which is to reliably enforce people's rights, because whether they win or lose is going to depend on who happens to win the fight. There's obviously a better solution. So my firm calls up his firm and say, look, we got this problem. What are we going to do? And what they do is they agree to go to a private court, to an arbitrator, and to accept the decision that that arbitrator reaches about who owns the television set. And after a while, it occurs to them that this problem is going to happen over and over again. So what they do is to agree in advance that any dispute between customers of these 2 firms will be settled by that private court. You say, but in this world there is no government to enforce that agreement. That's all right, because these 2 rights enforcement agencies are repeat players who are going to deal with each other for a long time. So the discipline of constant dealings enforces their contract with each other. Each of them knows that if the first time his side loses a case, they refuse to go along, the next time the other side won't go along, and they're back fighting each other. And if they do that, their costs are going to be high, the quality of the service they're providing is going to be low, and they'll lose all their customers to other firms that are more reasonable in their dealings with each other. So that's the guts of the system that I'm describing. And I want to talk first about how it works, what kind of law it's going to produce, and then second about what problems it might have, in what ways it might be less perfect than one would like. Notice that in this system, both law and law enforcement are now private goods produced on the private market. The law enforcement is produced by the rights enforcement agencies, and the law is produced by the private court, by the arbitration agency. And the question is, how does the private court decide what the law is going to be? And the answer is they are selling a service. They want the law that rights enforcement agencies will want to provide to their customers. Imagine, take the easy case. Suppose there's some change in the legal rules which on the whole customers of both agencies would like. Clearly, it is in the interest of the agencies to go to the court if it hasn't thought of it itself and say, look, why don't you change your rules, and this way we'll both agree to it. More interesting and harder case is suppose there's a change in the legal rules which customers of one agency like and the customers of the other agency don't. Maybe the agencies have customers with different political beliefs or who engage in different activities who differ in some important way. So one set of customers would like a strong requirement of proof for certain offenses and one a weak requirement. Or one of them wants, you can imagine all sorts of disagreements. In the book where I originally presented this, the example I gave was the death penalty. I said, imagine that the customers of one agency, on the whole, are in favor of a legal system with a death penalty. They are sure they will never commit murder. They're pretty sure they'll never be convicted of a murder they haven't committed, and they want to make sure that if anybody kills them, he'll die so that nobody will kill them. All right? The other agency feels the other way around. Its customers, on the whole, are worried either they morally object to the death penalty or they're worried they might be convicted either of a murder they committed or of a murder they didn't commit, and they would prefer not to have a death penalty. Each agency engages in some market research. First agency tries to figure out how much they could raise the amount they charge for their services if they could guarantee their customers death penalty law in disputes with the agency B. They conclude that their customers would be willing to pay an extra $1 million a year in total if only that feature was part of the product. The other agency does similar research, and they conclude that their customers would be willing to pay $2 million more to know that if they had a dispute with agency A, there would not be a death penalty. Well, solution is pretty simple. The anti-death penalty agency offers the pro-death penalty agency, assuming the initial rule is death penalty, abolish the death penalty, we pay you $1.5 million a year. We're better off, you're better off, net gain. And if you generalize this, you can see that it would pay the private court to try to find those legal rules that maximize the summed benefit to the customers of the two agencies. Because a change that benefits both is an easy sell, and a change that benefits one more than it harms the other only means you have to adjust your pricing to compensate for that. So that's the basic logic of that system. And the result is going to be something that looks like what economists would call economically efficient law. Where by economically efficient law, I mean those legal rules that maximize summed benefits to the people who are under the rules. All right? That's sort of a standard. Efficiency is a technical term in economics, and this isn't an economics class, so I'm not going to go into any details, but it's sort of a rough proxy for the idea of increasing the size of the pie, the degree to which everybody gets what he wants. Now, it's worth thinking about that from the libertarian standpoint, because there is no guarantee that what's going to come out of this is going to be the law that we like. My argument is that it will tend to be libertarian law because freedom on the whole is economically efficient. One of the several reasons most of us are libertarians is we believe that on the whole, people are happier, healthier, better off in a free society than in a less free society. And therefore, we would expect that there would be a tendency that a set of legal rules which were generated by the market to maximize individual benefits would tend to be the rules we like. To put it differently, it is unlikely to be the case that I would be willing to pay more for the ability to violate your rights than you would be willing to pay to be protected from that ability. It's not impossible, but it's an unlikely situation. But you can imagine counterexamples. The example I offered in the book is, suppose we're in a society where almost everybody regards heroin addiction as a really horrible thing, and therefore would much rather patronize an agency which goes to a court which holds that you can be locked up for using heroin than one that doesn't. Under those circumstances, you would get an unlibertarian law coming out of my market for law. You would get a law against the use of heroin. On the other hand, under those circumstances, you will get that law coming out of a government-produced legal system as well, as we can observe that we in fact do get. So the claim I would make is that it is at least unlikely that you would not get a substantially more libertarian outcome from what I've just described than you would get from the political alternative, which is what the minarchist position ultimately ends up with, namely some political mechanism generating legal rules. All right? Let me now discuss the problems with this system that I've described. And I'm going to start with the problems that I discussed about 40 years ago when I wrote The Machinery of Freedom, and then go on to some problems that I've thought about since, and also maybe to one or two solutions I've thought about since. And the first problem, and one of the more serious ones, is how does my anarchist society defend itself against aggressive states? This is the problem of national defense. And the reason it's a problem is that national defense is what economists call a public good. A public good does not mean a good produced by the government. I believe that at this very instant I am producing a public good. What do I mean by that? A public good to an economist has two characteristics. The first is that the producer cannot control who gets it. And the second is that one person consuming it doesn't prevent other people from consuming it. So a standard example of a public good would be a radio broadcast over the air prior to the development of encryption and similar technologies. All right? So if you broadcast a radio program, everybody within range can hear it. One person listening to it doesn't stop someone else from listening to it. And a standard problem for a free market is how do you produce public goods? Because the way we produce ordinary private goods is if the good is worth more to you than it cost me to produce it, I can make money by producing it and selling it to you. In the case of a public good, whether you get it doesn't depend on whether you pay for it. It depends on whether I can get everybody to pay enough. You will correctly believe, if the public is large, that your contribution is very unlikely to make a difference. Consequently, you can easily enough have a public good that is worth more than it costs to produce, and yet doesn't get produced. And that's one of the standard arguments that everybody but anarchists uses for why you need government. And it's a correct argument. It's just that government isn't a solution, because if you think it through, you see that the mechanisms that are supposed to make government behave themselves are shot through with public good problems. That, for example, if you make yourself a well-educated voter in order to vote for politicians who pass good laws, you have just spent a lot of time and energy producing a public good shared with everybody else in the United States. That's a public good with a public of 300 million people. It's not going to get produced, and that's why voters are rationally ignorant. Right? If you run through the way political mechanisms work, the problem economists call market failure, which is a situation where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality, such as public goods not getting produced, occurs because individuals are not bearing the cost of the actions they take or getting the benefits. That's an exception in the private market and the normal situation in the public market. If you think about how political institutions work, it is very rarely the case that a political actor either receives the benefit of correct decisions or pays the cost of wrong decisions. I guess my favorite example of this is actually in the judicial system. There is a particular court decision, I could discuss if people are curious in the question mark, in which a federal appeals court made a decision which hinged on a mathematical mistake that a smart high school student should have been ashamed of. And that decision almost certainly killed some thousands of people. It had to do with liability for vaccines, for the live polio vaccine. It held a company liable under circumstances in which, on the court's own argument, it should not have been liable. It was a mistake of about a factor of 40 in comparing costs and benefits. The result was for a couple of years to slow the development of vaccines, and that surely killed some thousands of people. The judges who made that decision never owed a penny to anybody. For what was clearly, I think, culpable negligence in their decision. So what's wrong with the standard argument that says that market failure is a reason for government is not that the free market works perfectly, but only that the alternative works worse, that we don't have a good way of making governments act in our interest, unfortunately. So let me now get back to the problem of national defense. National defense is the public good. If I set up a mechanism to keep the Russians or the Mexicans or the Canadians from invading, I'm producing a benefit for everybody else in the country. If I help pay for a military to defend the country, I'm producing a benefit shared by everybody else. When I originally wrote The Machinery of Freedom, the USSR was a going concern with a sizable army and a whole lot of thermonuclear weapons and missiles to deliver them. And at that time, it looked as though defending the U.S. required that somebody spend a good many billions of dollars in some kind of a military for the U.S. That particular problem solved itself, fortunately. We no longer have any real enemies. That is, any enemies powerful enough to matter. At the time of the first Iraq War, I did a calculation of the summed GNPs on the two sides of that war. And the odds in that war were almost exactly 100 to 1. That's not a war. So in that sense, at the moment, it's not a big problem. But if I'm concerned with the general issue of anarchy, it is an issue. The question is, how does a society without a government, without taxation, defend itself? I've got some ideas on that subject. If people are interested, I can talk about them more at the end. At this point, I just want to point out that that is a real problem for what I'm proposing, which is why the chapter in Machinery called that national defense the hard problem. There's a second problem, which I think you have to worry about. And that problem is, what if the rights enforcement agencies stop competing? Suppose that the equilibrium in the system I'm described is that there are 3 rights enforcement agencies. And one day they get together and they say, you know, this business about selling services to voluntary customers is all very nice. But think how much more money we could make if each of us agreed not to accept customers who wanted to shift agencies. All right? This is called cartelization. You're forming a cartel, and in fact what they are doing is reinventing government. All right? So you would then, government without whatever limits our present government has, because this is a blank sheet, as it were. So one of the things you want to worry about is whether in this system the rights enforcement agencies themselves might become rights violators, might decide to take over. So that's the second problem. Now, when I originally wrote the Machinery of Freedom, I concluded this probably wasn't a very big problem. And my argument was that if you look at present arrangements for producing the equivalent of what the agencies are producing, that is police forces basically enforcing the law, there don't seem to be large economies of scale. All right, for the non-economists in the room, economies of scale are the degree to which a large firm can produce cheaper than a small firm. And in real markets, there are some areas where there are economies of scale and some areas where there are diseconomies of scale, which is why it's rare to have one firm that dominates the entire market. And it looked to me as though the kind of thing rights enforcement agencies are doing doesn't have very large economies of scale. We don't observe that big city police departments can do a much better job cheaper than small city police departments, and that therefore probably you would have a world with 50 or 100 or 200 rights enforcement agencies, in which case if 2 or 3 of them get together, their customers all quit and go to the others to defend them against their old agency. Right? Now, let me now go on to a problem that I've thought about since I wrote that book. Because Machinery only got one really good book review, where what I define as a really good book review is a review that makes the author think. And that was a review by Jim Buchanan, a fairly prominent economist and a colleague of mine at one point. And Buchanan said lots of nice things about the book, but he said there's one problem. And the problem is that when we have the conflict, this is my way of putting his argument, when we have the conflict between the pro-death penalty and the anti-death penalty agency, what determines which side has to pay to get its way? In other words, is it that the default is no death penalty, and if the pro-death penalty makes an offer which the other agency may or may not accept, or is it that the default is a death penalty and the anti has to make the agency? Putting it in terms that any economist in the audience will recognize. I had analyzed the allocational implications of my market, but not the distributional implications. The question of who pays whom for what, as it were. If you think about an ordinary free market society, one question is how are inputs used to produce outputs for people. A different question is how much does each person get? And in an ordinary free market society, that second question partly depends on how you define property rights. Do I own myself, or do I start out being a slave of somebody else? You can imagine a market society with slavery. It wouldn't be a libertarian one, but it would economically be a market. Who owns the property? Does all the land revert to the Indians? That's going to give you a different allocation of resources than if the present, quote, owners own it, and so forth. And Jim's point was that I hadn't thought about that question with regard to the market for law. And he was right. I hadn't thought about it, so I started thinking about it. And I concluded that what's ultimately underlying that market is a underlying threat game. That what's really happening is that each company, in bargaining with the other and deciding who has to pay off whom in order to get their way, is saying if things break down and we start shooting at each other, what's going to happen? And in fact, thinking about it, it occurred to me that there's some sense in which all societies are built on underlying threat games. That there's some sense in which this society, if enough people are unhappy enough, they start shooting each other. Or they start having mass demonstrations, or they start, there are lots of different ways it can happen. But there's some sense in which any functioning society, most people believe they're getting less than they deserve, but somehow they've settled as much as they think they can get away with. And similarly, if you imagine the period when my society is getting set up, somehow the agencies are going to have to bargain to a division of who has to pay whom off. And then from that, they can bargain on to the efficient set of legal rules. And the reason this is a problem for me is that even if there are not economies of scale in enforcing rights, there might be economies of scale in threatening other agencies. All right, if you imagine a formative period when the question is, do we have to pay you to get the rules we want, or do we start with the rules we want, and if you want to change them, you have to pay us? It might be that bigger agencies would be in a better position to push smaller agencies around, in which case you might start out with a relatively small number of agencies, and that raises the danger of cartelization and of reinventing government. So that it occurred to me that Jim had not only raised a legitimate point that I had not thought about, but one that to some degree threatened my position. Now, I should go on to say that if you look at these equivalent mutual threat games in the world as it now exists, where many of them are played out between governments, the conclusion is that there's a very large stability to the status quo. That in principle, the border between the U.S. and Mexico depends on how strong each of them is. But you don't actually observe that every time one country's military budget goes up, the border moves half a mile the other way. So that what's going on is that everybody knows that violence is very expensive, that violence is, in some sense, typically a loss for both. Therefore, once you've got some point of agreement, you tend to stick to it. Hence, if I'm right, once my system is set up, the mutual threat recedes into the background. It's true that my agency has got a couple of tanks in the basement, partly just in case and partly sort of as souvenirs of the old Wild West days when things were just forming. But with luck, they're collecting dust. Hence, what really affects the size of agencies is at what size they can do a good job of protecting their customers' rights. And if that's the way it works, then we're in reasonably good shape in terms of having a system with lots of agencies and therefore stability. So that's one point which occurred to me where I had missed something when I originally analyzed this 40-some years ago, and where, thanks to Jim pointing out the problem, I was now in a position to some degree at least answer or deal with it. Now, there's a different problem that occurred to me on my own, which undercuts my argument for efficient law. That it occurred to me that just as on private markets are imperfectly efficient because of market failure, because of the fact that situations like public goods mean that the actor is not really receiving all the benefit or bearing all the cost of his action, and therefore it sometimes doesn't pay you to do something even though it's worth doing, or pays you to do something even though it's not worth doing. That's sort of a standard. Again, those of you familiar with arguments about public goods and externalities and all the rest of it, that's what that's about. And it occurs to me that there are certain forms of predictable market failure on the market for law. And the clear case is when the legal rule between me and you affects him. All right? So let me give you an example, which won't bother some of you because it's for a law you aren't in favor of anyway, but which is an example where you might have a law that was economically efficient that you didn't get. And that's intellectual property. Suppose my agency is negotiating with your agency on whether you have to respect my copyrights. All right? You're agreeing to respect my copyrights, results in some money to me paid by you. That's a wash. That's a gain to me equal to a cost to you. It results in a net loss due to the fact that you might choose not to read a book even though it cost me nothing for you to do it because you're not willing to pay the price. The deadweight burden of IP law. And it results in a further cost because we're going to have to enforce the rule. So someone's going to have to spend time and effort figuring out whether you're pirating my books or not. All right? So far, it looks like a net loss. There's a transfer of money plus two costs. But the reason why copyright might be a good idea is that if nobody pays me to write books, I might not write books. And you can't read them if I don't write them. So the factor on the other side is that IP, copyright, gives people an incentive to produce intellectual property, and that's a net gain. But when you and I agree that you will respect my copyrights, most of that gain goes to them. All right? That is to say, most of the gain of my writing additional books goes to customers of other agencies. They can free ride on it. Indeed, more gain goes to them because they, since their agencies haven't agreed to copyright, can not only copy my books, they can do it for free. So that means that the market incentive to get intellectual property law is below the economically efficient incentive, because the incentive of the agencies that are negotiating the law includes the wash, it includes the costs, but it does not include the major benefit. All right? And therefore, even if intellectual property law is a good thing, I should say I'm a neutral in this particular war. I think there are arguments both for and against intellectual property. But even if intellectual property law is a good thing, you probably won't get it. And with a little ingenuity, you can think of other cases of the same sort. So if you think about air pollution, your ability to sue me for polluting your air provides an external benefit to other people who the air also blows onto. And therefore, your agency has an inadequate incentive to negotiate rules in which I'm liable for polluting your air. So in general, just as on other markets, there are going to be areas where we get short of the efficient rule due to the fact that the people making the decision, which is ultimately the customers of the agencies deciding what legal rules they want, are not bearing all of the costs and benefits of their actions because sometimes the legal rule between me and you affects him. All right? So I could go on and say more about the sort of details of the economics, but since you're not economists, probably it's not worth doing. What I'm doing now is checking the time. I got lots of time. That's what I wanted to know. So let me instead talk about a different issue. And this is one which I think I got right in the book, but right at insufficient depth, as it were. And it has to do with a question that arises when you tell people you're an anarchist, and they say, oh, you believe that people are nice and will never violate anybody else's rights. You say, no, I don't believe any of that nonsense. In my anarchist system, you rob from me, you're going to go to jail or pay a fine or something, and you don't want to pay the fine? Well, big, strong guys are going to make you pay the fine. That is, my system is not a pacifist system. It's not a system with no enforcement of rights. It's just a system which enforcement of rights is not by government. All right? And then you describe your system in some detail, and they say, what do you mean? You're not an anarchist. You just want a different form of government. Your rights enforcement agencies are a bunch of little competing governments, so how can you claim to be an anarchist? And that got me thinking about what turns out to be a non-trivial question, which is why we call some things governments and not other things governments. All right? Because if you think of things that governments do, it's very hard to think of anything at all that a government does that isn't done by some non-governmental actors. For example, as some of you who study history may know, the English in the time of King Alfred, the Anglo-Saxons, had trouble being invaded by a bunch of Norsemen. Those Norse armies were not state armies. They were entrepreneurial projects. Right? You have a military leader, and he says to a bunch of other Vikings, look, there's lots of land and loot in England, let's go take some of it. So making war does not define a government. And it's very hard if you go through it to think about anything that defines a government. And it's all very well to talk about the legitimate right to enforce laws, but what does legitimate mean? It means the government says it can do it. Well, I can have the legitimate right to enforce laws too. I'll say I can do it. So what defines a government? And that got me thinking about a related question, and that question is, what are rights? And I want to claim, I should say I had an answer in machinery, and what I want to give you is just the worked out version of the answer. The answer in machinery was a government is an agency of legitimized coercion, and I went on to explain that I was using both words in special senses. That what I meant by coercion was not a moral category. People can disagree on what's coercion. What I meant by coercion was simply those things viewed in that particular society as rights violations. So that in our society, if I want to hire you and I say, you're working for me now, and if you don't like it, I'll lock you up, we regard that as something like kidnapping, and it's clearly a rights violation. Similarly, if I say, I want to sell you something, and by the way, you don't have the choice of not buying it, that also we consider a rights violation. And there might be other societies that had a different category. So I'm not a moral philosopher. I'm not talking about what's really right. I'm only saying the kind of activities that in dealing with ordinary people we think of as rights violation. That's coercion. What do I mean by legitimized? I don't mean morally legitimate. I mean you don't respond the way you normally respond to rights violations. That when a guy grabs your cell phone, you yell, run after him, even though it may not be worth the trouble. It might be that you figure getting into a fight with him costs more than the worth of the cell phone. You do it anyway. You don't react that way when the IRS seizes your property. So what I mean by legitimized is only that these acts of coercion don't call forth the response that normally comes for coercion. And I thought about that some more, and it occurred to me that property rights predate our species. This is a useful response to people who tell you you shouldn't complain about government taking your property. The only reason you have property is because government gives you property rights. Because there is a pattern of behavior in some species of animals that's called territorial behavior, common among birds and fishes in particular. And the basic pattern is that one member of the species in some way marks territory as the territory it's claiming. Some species, they urinate around the border. Some of them, it's by bird songs. There are various different ways. Somehow, that animal turns a switch in its brain such that if another member of the same species and gender trespasses, it will fight to the death to stop it. A fight to the death is almost always a loss for both parties. So that means that if you are the trespasser and you know that the other member of your species has committed to defend the territory, it pays you to retreat. Because even if you win the fight, the damage from a fight to the death is almost certainly more than the access to the territory is worth. Wouldn't be true if you're enormously bigger and stronger. It's not a perfect method. But at anything close to equality, the fact that one of them is committed to fight means the other one backs down. Right? What I want to claim is that rights in humans are simply the fancy version of that system. That rights in humans are a set of mutually perceived commitment strategies, such that each of us has drawn invisible lines, and if the society works, my invisible lines almost never cross yours. So it's almost never the case that I'll fight to the death to keep something and you'll fight to the death to take it. And since each of us can recognize this set of commitment strategies, each of us normally, most of the time, doesn't violate what the other people see as their rights. This is where I think I was a positive account of rights. If you want the detailed version, it's on my webpage. My webpage, by the way, is www.daviddfriedman.com. Pretty easy to remember. And it's got lots and lots of stuff on it, including the full text of Machinery of Freedom and lots of my articles. So my argument is that a way of making sense of rights, not as a moral category, as a legal category, but as a way of understanding human behavior, is that in any society, individuals have committed themselves to bear unreasonably large costs in defense of certain things. Other individuals know that and therefore don't trespass. And I think that makes sense out of a lot of things we observe in the real world. One of my standard examples was the Falklands War. All right, some of you are too young to remember it. But there were a couple of barren islands up near Antarctica, occupied by, I suppose, about 80 Englishmen, maybe 90, I don't know, but a small number. And Argentina thought they belonged to Argentina, and England thought they belonged to England. And Argentina invaded, and the UK sent its only aircraft carrier and a chunk of its fleet and fought a war up in the frigid waters near Antarctica in order to retain these two barren islands. And your first response is, this is insane. The islands aren't worth 1/100th what they were risking by fighting that war. And yet it seems to make perfect sense to us. All right? Because after all, England, the UK thought those islands were theirs. Everybody knew they thought those islands were theirs. And if their response to Argentina seizing it is it's not worth defending it, well, Spain might like Gibraltar. China might like to grab Hong Kong back, which back then I think the UK still had without permission. Various other people like bits and pieces of stuff. So it made sense to have the commitment strategy and to follow through on it, even though on the face of it, it seems not to make sense. So I think a different example I like when I'm explaining this part of the ideas is, imagine we live in some suburban neighborhood which has a pretty inefficient government. And one day my next door neighbor calls me over to the fence and says, you know, I'd like to talk to you. I find it's a real nuisance taking my stuff down to the trash dump every week. So I've decided instead I'm just going to dump it over the fence onto your property. And you know and I know that trying to get the local authorities to do anything about it is going to cost you a whole lot more trouble than just trucking away my trash every time you go to the dump. But I got a deal for you. Pay me $15 a month and I won't. Why do I never consider taking that deal? And the answer is because I have drawn a line in my head, which he knows about, which is I don't pay off to extortion. And after all, if I do pay off, it might be $25 next month, $30 the month after. So I think a lot of the way human societies run can be made sense of if you think of human societies as this network of interacting commitment strategies. Again, this is really part of a different talk, but I figured I was supposed to talk for a fair while, and this is interesting stuff, so I talk about it. If you want the long version of it, I've got a whole lot of my talks up on my webpage, too. So now I've got I can now fill out what I originally said 40 years ago about an agency of legitimized coercion. Because what the government is the organization against which we drop the commitment strategy. That the defining feature of government is that government does those things which ordinary individuals would go to a good deal of trouble to retaliate for its doing and not get that retaliation. And I think that makes sense. It explains what government is, and it explains why my agencies are not governments. Because my agencies don't claim any rights that aren't seen as ordinary rights of ordinary people. They'll make mistakes, of course. Sometimes the court will get the wrong verdict, so they'll sometimes violate rights just as individuals will sometimes unintentionally violate rights. But the response would be no different than if an individual made a mistake and took something that he thought was his and was really yours, say. So I think that gives an answer to what anarchy is. It gives an answer to what government is, and I think that's a useful answer. So I think at this point I have probably talked for about as long as I ought to be talking before you get a chance to talk. I was told long ago that the advantage of answering questions from an audience is that when you're doing so, you can be reasonably sure that at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. So I will now stop and take questions.
Check. Please direct your questions into the microphone so that we can get them on videotape, please.
So what about the situation where you have different protection agencies for different things? Suppose your heroin example. Now, I have a normal protection agency that protects me against 99% of things. But, you know, I like to deal a little heroin now and again with my friends. Somebody finds out about this. My regular protection agency says, fuck you, Joe, we're not going to protect you from that. It's in our clause that we don't protect you from that. But I have a second agency that says, if anybody tries to enforce heroin laws against you, we're going to send out a hitman to take out some of the leaders of that protection agency. So I have like a second backstop to this. Have you considered that?
The agency isn't making the rules. The rules are rules of an arbitration agency, and what the agency has got to do in order to be in business is to get agreements with other agencies it might collide with, specifying arbitration agencies. So your pro-heroin agency either has gotten agreements from all the other agencies saying, yes, your customers can use heroin, or it hasn't, in which case every case it ends up in a fight, and since it's outnumbered to 99-1, it loses enough fights so it goes out of business. So one of the mistakes people keep making when I describe this is assuming that it's the agency that's making the law. But the agency can't make the law because you have the problem of the cross cases, of what happens when a customer of one agency has a dispute with a customer of another agency. And therefore what the agencies have to do is to each pair of them agree on the law. Now, one of the results of this is that you are not going to have, you need not have identical laws for everybody. All right? It's entirely possible that in a dispute with you, the case will go to a court which believes in deciding such cases by a preponderance of the evidence. An identical case with him, it'll go to a case that says beyond a reasonable doubt, and so forth for any other issue. There will be some pressure to consistency, because it's easier to run the system the less variation there is, and just as you get some standardization on ordinary markets, you'll get some, but you will also have some subgroups to whom it's important to have. Suppose you live in a barren area. It's important to you to have very detailed water law. So you have an agency which makes a point of negotiating with everybody in sight to agree with them that you have detailed laws on who can use water. Other people don't want that. They aren't short of water. So it's a polylegal system in which the legal rule that applies is a function of the pair of people who are dealing with each other. Does that make sense of it? Yeah. Yes.
Yes. It's an excellent talk. Thank you. One issue that struck me immediately is this notion that you raised at the end about how the government is the actor that when it coerces, we drop our normal red lines. Yes. Okay. But I'm not sure that's entirely true in reality as we know it today. For example, we just had a presentation by Cop Watch, which is out filming police. Many of us do draw very good red lines around police, and even ordinary citizens, when they reach a certain point of abuse, will often stand with the police. But I challenge anyone here to set up Mafia Watch, where you're going out and filming mafia enforcers as they go about their business of enforcing rules and settling disputes and making money at it. And this raises to me the question of whether we're not already living in a world in which we're dropping our red lines more for the private dispensers of justice, namely the organized criminals who really rule our world, and whether this problem wouldn't get even worse if we eliminated the official trappings and the mythologies and the irrationality surrounding government.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, in part because I don't know what mafia means in the U.S. contexts. I know a good deal about the Sicilian Mafia, which is a pretty well-defined organization that we have at least a fair amount of information, and which was, in fact, a system of private rights enforcement as well as a certain amount of extortion and a variety of other things. Still is, I guess, though how much I don't know. But I would say that what is true is that the lines aren't necessarily fixed, so that over time, views may change. Let me take an example which struck me quite recently. which is a case of routine robbery or theft, I guess, that almost nobody objects to, although there is no moral argument for it. And that is grocery store carts. You see somebody going down the street with a grocery store cart, obviously stolen from a local grocery store, loaded with stuff. And you don't call the cops. At least nobody I know calls the cops. And that's a case where, because the enforcement of the relative property rights was fairly hard, the violation was very common, so in some sense, people modified what they saw in terms of their normal, of what their normal definitions were. And there's no good moral argument for it, but I think it describes actual behavior. In the case of filming cops, of course, the legal rule says you're allowed to do it. So you're acting within that system. What you're not doing is going up to the cop and grabbing his arm and saying you can't do whatever you're doing because it's immoral. You're not responding in the way you would respond to an ordinary. The way you respond to an ordinary robber stealing from you is not by filming him. All right? But now the whole question of filming cops, as you say, is very interesting, but it's interesting for another set of reasons. That if any of you have read David Brin's book, The Transparent Society, the first two chapters of which are quite good, though I think it goes downhill after that. And Brin's argument is that technology is moving us towards a world with no privacy, towards a world in which everything that happens, at least in public places, is recorded and findable. And he argues you cannot stop that change, but what you can do is make the transparency go in both directions. So the cops can watch us, but we can watch them. And the filming of cops is a real-world example of what he described happening, that to some extent the police are beginning to be somewhat limited by the fact that we can observe them in recordable fashion.
As I understand it, your argument is, or your proposal is, that a world without government would be a world of competing rights enforcement agencies.
Correct.
Competing for customers and so on. How would you respond to the statement that the world we have today on a global scale of all these different nations is already that world?
The answer is that the current ones are territorial sovereigns, that you can't both live in the U.S. and, except under special dispensation, as it were, have your rights protected by Canada or Mexico, and that territorial sovereigns are in a monopoly position. It is true that their behavior is to some degree limited by competition, and it may be more limited in the future. I don't know how many of you have ever read any of the work of C. Northcott Parkinson. He was an English academic who was very good at making serious arguments in humorous essays. And he's best known for what's called Parkinsons Law. Parkinsons Law has two statements, two versions. The first version is work expands to fill the time available. And the second version is the number of people employed by a bureaucracy increases at a constant rate, independent of whether the work to be done increases, decreases, or there's any work at all. And this sounds like a joke, but he's got data. Parkinson gives you the figures for the number of onshore employments of the British employees of the British Admiralty during the period when England was going from the greatest naval power the world had ever known to barely able to beat Argentina. And the number of onshore employees keeps going up. He gives a similar graph for the number of employees, essentially, of the in UK part of administering the British Empire during the period when the British Empire was disappearing. Parkinson has another essay which has to do with the limitations of government spending. And his numbers, unfortunately, are optimistic. But the basic point was a pretty good one, where the way he put it was, the productive people of the world have discovered by long and bitter experience that they will usually have to give about 10% of their income to some gangster, feudal lord, or Department of Internal Revenue. It matters little what you call it. When the rates get higher than that, the Israelites start looking at the Atlas. There are probably better places to be than Egypt. And the point there is that to some degree, governments are restricted by competition. And I would like to argue that one result of technological change may be to make them more so restricted. Because as more and more of our life moves to cyberspace, we become more and more mobile. If almost all of your friends are online, if you're telecommuting to your work, You can choose to live in any wide variety of different places, and governments are therefore more nearly compelled to compete for taxpayers. So I would not claim that none of this is happening. But as long as governments are territorial sovereigns, the cost of shifting providers is very high, and that puts them in a monopoly position. Part of the way I described it back in Machinery was to imagine a world where everybody lived in house trailers, and the cost of moving was essentially zero. And one day it's announced that France and Germany are about to go to war. And the next day the sun rises on an empty landscape populated by a whole bunch of war reporters and some armies and nobody else, because everybody else has left.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you for the great talk, and thanks for coming out. So what we're looking for then, in the words of the Tannehills, we're looking for a market for liberty. And right now, there's this, overbearing market for tyranny. There are organizations which benefit heavily from the state, and that's why the state is perpetuated. Have you given any thought for how we get from the market for tyranny to a market for liberty when there are so many powerful institutions that are well entrenched and well invested in the statist paradigm?
Yes, there are a number of possible I should say I am not offering any promises it'll happen.
Absolutely.
But there are a number of possible ways things can change. One of them goes back to my point about rational ignorance, that voters have no incentive to be well informed. They still vote. And I think it's useful to think of the mechanism that controls a democratic government as having a coarse control knob and a fine control knob, the way old microscopes used to have. And the coarse control knob is free information. The coarse control knob is what everybody knows, true or false. So that what things politicians can do and get votes for partly depends on what things people think are good. So that, for example, the coarse control knob, unfortunately, is making free immigration very hard. Because any politician who said, look, we ought to let in all these people who want to be Americans, would get voted out. And that's because most people in America think they know that letting in lots of foreigners would be a terrible thing. The coarse control knob, though, also means that when it becomes clear that the NSA is spying on people on an enormous scale, it becomes politically very expensive to keep doing it. And what will finally happen in that controversy, I don't know. The fine control knob is special interest lobbying politics, and that does all the detailed work. We can't do much about the fine control knob. We can do something about the coarse control knob, because where does free information come from? It comes from textbooks and novels and television programs and movies and courses. I said about half an hour ago that at this very instant I was producing a public good. That was what I meant. That part of the point of this talk is to spread a set of ideas that hopefully will increase the chance that 50 years from now this will be a free country. Doing that is a public good. I don't get to charge the people who, if I'm successful, will be freer as a result. Like many public goods, it still gets privately produced because I can get enough benefit from producing it to be worth producing it. I get to visit New Hampshire, which is a really pretty state where I spent most of the summers growing up in. I get to socialize with lots of interesting people. I get to have some pretty tasty ice cream, though that I had to pay for because there's a $5 excise tax on the ice cream here around here. Never heard of such a thing anywhere else. That's enough, so I'm willing to do it. But nonetheless, it is a public good. So one of the answers is that one can spread ideas. And one can do that by being a professional academic and trying to change what's taught in universities. You can do that the way H.L. Mencken did by being a brilliant essayist and writing newspaper articles and essays that people read and repeat and change how they think about things. You can do it by starting Bitcoins, or you can do it, to take a much more mundane example, by starting the UPS and FedEx and thus demonstrating that you don't really need the post office. So ways in which you do it, one way is by changing the mix of free information, by making arguments, by giving demonstrations, and so forth. that one of the mistakes that libertarians have in the past been prone to, I'm not sure it's still true, is believing that there is one right answer to bringing liberty. That it's tempting to say, well, I've figured out that the solution is to join the Libertarian Party and elect a candidate, so all of you should do it too. And it's a very bad idea, because some of you really hate politicking, but might be very good at teaching high school, or at writing a novel, or at starting a business. And so the right answer is going to be different answers for different people. So that's one approach, is to change the mix of free information out there so as to make it politically more costly to do bad things and more profitable to do good things. And people have been working on that project for a long time. My father was more successful than most of us in that project, but other people have done things as well. Ayn Rand was relatively successful in that project, not successful enough, but she did her bit. Another thing you can do is to find ways of working around the government. So that I've been arguing for some time that online technology raises the possibility of a world which is anarcho-capitalist in cyberspace and run by governments in real space. Because, as some of you know, public key encryption provides potentially very powerful tools for a world where third parties can neither observe nor interfere in the interactions between two parties. And I've got various discussions and articles of that on my webpage. So that's a different solution. And
Crypto anarchy.
Yes, that's right. The stuff, the cypherpunks. I had some connections with the cypherpunks, whatever, 30 years ago when they were active. Only 20, all right. So in any case, so that's a possibility. Another possibility is my son Patri's scheme, which is you create a technology for inexpensive floating housing, and you then have two options to use it. One of them is you have this giant raft made up of a lot of little rafts, and you anchor it somewhere in some country's territorial waters, and you're under that country's rule, and it protects you from piracy, and it collects taxes, but it knows that if it doesn't treat you very well, you'll call up the tugboats and move to a different country. So at that point, the constraint by mobility becomes much stronger. The alternative approach, the sort of extreme version of seasteading, is you moor your rafts outside of territorial waters. You set up whatever rules you like. You worry about pirates a bit. And the nice thing about that is you then have a competitive market for governments. Because if after 5 years half the people on your little artificial island decide that they've got it wrong and we should do this instead of that, call up the tugboats, pull your two halves of the island apart, find some other people who agree with you and form a new island, and you can imagine a much more fluid and flexible system for creating political institutions. So there are all ways you might be able to do it. Which way it's going to happen or any of them, I don't know.
Great answer, thank you. So the short version, create a market for liberty now and invite people on board.
That's certainly one possibility.
Thank you so much.
I would invite you to check out the tax-free ice cream at the Agora Valley up the hill there. Oh, okay.
They said the ice cream was free, but the tax was $5.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood your point.
That's what their sign says. It wasn't my idea.
Anyway, the what you were talking about with competing agencies and your rethinking of it as the economy of scale of being able to kind of intimidate,
to threaten other
agencies,
right?
The fact, though, that in a stateless society, there would be a tremendous amount of transparency required for such an agency. Otherwise, people would be very chary to spend money to an agency that did not want to disclose what their funding was like. So it would be very difficult to hide a buildup of arms to try to take over the other agencies and then become
Why
a
do you have
government.
to hide it? Your customers are perfectly happy about the fact that you're going to be able to bully other agencies into giving them good terms.
Well, in a stateless society, though, I think we wouldn't have a stateless society at the point where people would be willing to pay other people to bully them, okay?
As far as I do not want to rely on changes in human morality to make a system work. It seems to me that what I want to do is to assume human beings are going to be about the way they are, and to see if I can figure out institutions that will produce about the results I want.
Well,
I think that one of the approaches some libertarians have used is to say we convert everybody to being libertarian and the problem disappears. The experiment's been done a couple of hundred years ago. Didn't work very well, right? I mean, the Constitution is a pretty good Constitution as such things go, but didn't enforce itself. It'd be a long discussion. But this has partly to do with my disagreement with both Rothbard and Rand, because both of them imagine that the solution is to get the philosophy right, and then everybody will agree. And whereas what I want to do is to say, actually have a competing market to generate your law, rather than having libertarian legal philosophers persuade everybody else of what the right law is.
Okay. The cost of it still would be an economic issue, because an agency that planned to bully other agencies would have to charge higher rates, at least at the outset, to pay for all that buildup.
This is the economy of scale argument. If it turns out that big agencies can bully cheaper than small agencies, then they can offer better terms to their customers, because they're getting the other agencies to agree to the terms their customers want, or else to pay them not to agree to the terms their customers want.
One point you made I found interesting about the commitment strategies, but you put it, I guess, in a slightly different way than I've usually heard it. So maybe I can just summarize the way I've heard it, and I think it's the same thing you're saying, and you can tell me whether it actually is the same thing. That, like, you said you define the state as legitimized coercion. I've usually heard it as Max Weber's legitimate monopoly on the use of force, but I think kind of the same. So that if by legitimation we simply mean that in the popular conception it's legitimate, whether it morally is or not, that's how people know?
Not what I mean. It's being legitimate in the popular conception might be a reason why, but legitimized is defined by how people react to it, not by what they believe. I don't think it's legitimate, but I don't yell "stop thief" if the IRS seizes my property. All right? I don't even if the government violates my rights in one way or another, I will not engage in counteraction that is more costly than it's worth. That's the commitment strategy. This is going back to the doomsday machine, if people are familiar with that in the old thermonuclear war thing. That the commitment strategy is like a doomsday machine. It's saying, if you cross this line, I'll bear very large costs. Therefore, you won't cross the line. Therefore, I won't have to bear the costs. I don't respond that way to the government, even though I don't think it's legitimate. So it seems to me that saying that it depends on people believing it's legitimate, that's only one of the possible reasons. Another possible reason is that people say, look, I know the government has overwhelming power, so I know I'm going to lose. Everybody else knows the government has overwhelming power, so the fact that I give in to the government doesn't mean I'll give in to them. So therefore, I can carve out an exception in my commitment strategy, and should. My long explanation involves things called Schelling points, and if you look on my web page, I explain that, but I'm not going to try to do that here.
Thank you.
On the topic of competition between governments, and in particular issues like micronations and secession, is there some sort of litmus test where, if you have 200 houses that are in a private homeowners association or a municipality, or if you have Lithuania versus Disneyland, do you have some litmus test where you'd call a micronation
I have an old article from Liberty Magazine which is trying to respond to the argument people sometimes make that libertarians say that some of the things government produces could instead be produced by proprietary communities. The home builder who sets up a community association when he builds the houses, and everybody who buys a house is buying into the community association, and it takes care of the public areas and the roads. And one response libertarians get is, but wait a minute, isn't that a government? And my reply to that is yes and no. That is to say, it is something like a government, but it was produced by the market, and therefore, if it's a government, it's going to be an optimal government. And the actual article in Liberty was called Communist Trucks. And I was saying, what's the difference between a communist truck and a capitalist truck? It isn't that somehow having a hammer and sickle on it makes it not work. It's that the incentive structure that produces communist trucks produces bad trucks, and the incentive structure that produces badly designed trucks, and the incentive structure that produces capitalist trucks produces good, well-designed ones. The incentive structure that produces the homeowners association, the person who's designing it has an incentive to get it right, because he doesn't have any members until he sells those houses. And his ability to sell the houses depends partly on how well he structured the homeowners association. An individual buyer has an incentive to be well informed there because his decision actually determines what he gets, whereas the individual voter doesn't have such an incentive. So the argument, therefore, is that you're getting a government-like thing, but a thing that was produced by the market and is therefore going to be closer to well-designed. All right.
Forgive me if I'm beating a dead horse at all. One of the reasons I was attracted to your works over somebody like a Rothbard especially is because you do take into account the fact that, you know, people have different values and moralities and whatnot, and this levels with them. But on some degree, and this is where I'm getting a little bit confused, is because the idea is to, you know, split law up into, you know, being provided by the various firms and whatnot. But with the prevalence of, you know, philosophies like humanism and whatnot, it seems like to some degree you still have to have some amount, and not a drastic one, obviously, but some amount of a shifting in people's moral values because of, you know, it's kind of like the motivations for American intervention, you know, other countries is to, you know, spread democracy and peace and freedom to other countries. And it seems like to try and implement a polylegal order would be to kind of throw away some of those values. And I just want to know...
I'm not sure I understand what values you're throwing away.
Well,
you can still contribute to the equivalent of the Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. If you want to help some revolutionary force, you can get together with other people and say, well, we won't even have a law preventing you from sending arms to the Syrian rebels, which is currently illegal unless the government does it. So I'm not sure why you would have to give up the ambition to improve the world just because you didn't have a government.
Well, because I think a lot of people shift that responsibility onto the state, but...
How much are they willing to pay to do it?
Probably not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of the issue is that you're getting closer to a system where what you want you pay for. And there are a lot of things that people want as long as you don't have to pay for them. And I think that's probably going to include largely a lot of the foreign intervention. And if they are willing to pay for it, they can contribute to funding private insurrections in various countries.
Hi. So the brunt of your argument seems to suggest that you don't need a lot of libertarians to have a fundamentally libertarian society, as I understand it. But to what extent do you think that, especially in the transitional phase, as we might be getting into a polycentric legal order, might there be a need for a libertarian vanguard, if you will?
I think having lots of libertarians will make it easier to cut down the size of the state. I don't know if the state ever gets abolished. I don't know how many of you read Snow Crash, which is quite an entertaining science fiction novel in which there are still buildings with people who think they're government employees. They just aren't doing anything. It's sort of, nobody is noticed when the government vanishes, as it were. But I think in principle you would, part of it depends on what you define as a libertarian. So suppose people believe that their kids will be better educated with a voucher system. Well, that's a shift in the libertarian direction because the government's getting less control over education. They may not be ideologically libertarian. They may just, you know, you can believe the market. If you believe the market works, are you a libertarian? What if you think the most important thing in the world is helping the poor? And I have no moral objection to the government taxing the rich and helping the poor. It's just I don't think it's going to do it, whereas the free market will. Is that being libertarian? I don't know. But spreading ideas that government intervention works badly is going to make it easier to shift in the direction of this kind of society, I think.
Right, as far as prescriptive as well as descriptive notions of libertarianism being effective.
Both could help. Certainly the more people feel government doing things that's wrong, the greater the political costs of doing them. But I think what actually makes the society work is going to be rational self-interest, not ideology, if that makes sense.
Thank you, sir.
So a couple people said something similar to this already, I think. Well, first of all, I want to say I really enjoyed your talk. And for the most part, unfortunately for you, you're preaching to the converted in my case.
That's
but,
unfortunate. But
yeah.
Somewhere I can probably find a few people who don't agree with me.
Yeah. Where I do partially disagree, though, is it seems that the three sort of difficulties that you described, one of them was the problem of distribution, like in the case of the firms that have to negotiate with each other. The
problem isn't really the problem of distribution. The problem is the risk that the problem of distribution will drive you to larger firms, which will give you a problem of cartelization.
In any case, what I wanted to say was it seems that all three of those were stemming from what you then later described as your disagreement with, like, Rothbard and Rand, yes. Which is that it all comes from assuming, like, this system of anarcho-capitalism into existence without people, which seems to presuppose that people are libertarians. Like, it presupposes contract law people, that they at least don't believe that the states are territorial sovereigns. You know what I mean? Like, it
requires the states not be territorial sovereign. People believe it or not.
Well,
you could imagine a version of this coming into existence simply because the government becomes unable to enforce its rules. Mm-hmm. You might imagine you will believe the government's got the right to do all of this and that, but we're all making our money online. We all have strong encryption. The government finds it can't collect any taxes because it can't observe our income. And, no philosophical change at all, but the government fades away because it runs out of money. That would be one possible future you could imagine. So it doesn't depend on philosophical changes. Philosophical changes might help, but I don't have any good theory of how you make philosophical changes happen. Unlike Rand, I don't believe I can prove that my philosophical position is right. I don't know of any way of showing that that violating rights is evil. It seems evil to me. It seems to me to have bad consequences, but I don't have good arguments for my moral position. I have good arguments for my economic position, and I therefore want to rest my case for libertarianism on that.
But what you were describing as like a system of agreements between people, like the types of,
But the agencies are not looking for the moral law. They're looking for the law that people want to live under. And you might say, I am entitled to violate your rights in such and such a way. But the only way I'm able to get that is if I let you violate my rights in some other ways, and that cost is bigger than the benefit. So that you could easily enough imagine a situation in which people compromise on recognizing each other's freedom, not because they believe it's morally legitimate, but only because the only way of not doing it is to give up some of their freedom and they're not willing to do it.
But by this definition, we already have a market for law. It's just that what the actors are finding to be most efficient and profitable is holding on to territorial monopolies and investing in law, the types of laws that benefit, have concentrated benefits with a few people and dispersed costs and things like that. And so,
but that's coming out of a particular
sort of open definition of a market for law. We already have it.
This is coming out of a particular system of institutions in which.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yes.
I want to ask a slightly different question about people's perceptions, and I'm not really talking about morals here. But the reason, for example, that if Jesse, who was just asking that question, tomorrow proclaimed that he was the United States government, people would probably just ignore him. Whereas if some other group of people who live in Washington claim that they are part of the United States government, we tend to pay attention. In order for the system we're talking about to actually function, people have to believe that these protection agencies are the way one goes about things, that these laws are reasonable laws. They have to have a cultural adherence to the system, even if they are not per se libertarians. And the cultural adherence is, I would argue, also a very large shift. and one we also don't know how to bring about in people's heads.
But there's a certain sense in which everybody in the world is a conservative. That everybody pretty much takes for granted what they're used to as being sort of the normal way of doing things. So that means that the more you can get what I'm describing established, the more people will simply take it for granted without a philosophical shift. There's a short story by the science fiction writer Werner Vinge called The Ungoverned, which is about the invasion of an anarcho-capitalist territory by an adjacent state. And one of the neat points he makes is the way people on each side of the conflict take their institutions for granted. So that in this story, this is a future story, and in the anarcho-capitalist society, there are some people who Vinge calls armadillos. And an armadillo is somebody who is sufficiently unhappy with the existing system so that instead of having a rights enforcement agency, he in effect becomes a sort of a high-tech hermit, sets up his own defensive perimeter, and doesn't have a lot to do with other people. And in the story, there is a wealthy farmer who is an armadillo, whose son lost an arbitration case 20 years earlier. And he has been spending his resources fortifying his farm in various ways. There's an invasion by a poorer adjacent state, and some teenagers manage to lure the invasion in the direction of this farm by a fake attack with some fireworks, I think. And because the farmer's put his resources for a long time into doing this, and it's a richer society, his private defenses are a significant fortress from the standpoint of the attacking army. And the attacking army spends some time and energy reducing this fortress. It never occurs to them to walk around it, because from their standpoint, this is obviously part of the defensive perimeter of the enemy. The fact that it is the private property of somebody who has opted out of the enemy system wouldn't occur to them. Finally, they succeed in destroying his defenses, and it turns out that he has a last-ditch defense. He's got an A-bomb, and he has a very deep hole that he and his family go into, and they set off an A-bomb over their heads and take out a third of the invading army. And there is somebody from the local rights enforcement agency who is, if I remember correctly, a prisoner at this point in the headquarters of the invading army. And when they realize what's happened, the leader of the invading army turns and says, "What kind of slime are you using nukes against us?" And the guy looks at him in astonishment and says, "What do you mean us? He's not our customer." So I thought one of the really neat ideas was seeing the way. I should say, one reason I like the story is that Vinge credits me for the background at the end of it. He's a friend of mine. But the thing he saw, as it were, which I didn't really see, is the way in which once institutions exist, people take them for granted and see everything from the standpoint of their institutions.
By the way, I always thought that he pronounced it Vinge.
I've never asked him. I pronounce it Vinge, but I don't really know if I'm right.
Excellent talk. Thank you for coming. And thank you for coming back after your initial experience with the Free State Project. You've come here, of course, to give us a public good. Many of us in the room, I know several of us here, have moved here to New Hampshire to try and do something similar along those lines. Now, the goal is stated philosophically: the maximum role of government is the protection of life, liberty, and property. That's not exactly a competing law society, although it could exist in that framework. So I'm curious if you can summarize an economic argument as to why in the world do we, or would we, or should we do that in the first place? How did we all get here, economically speaking?
Why are you people here?
And why are you here?
Well, but I'm not living here.
I know, but you've come to give us
the answer is that one of the ways in which there are a bunch of mechanisms for private production of public goods. One of them is when there are enough private benefits from it so that they more than cover the cost, and therefore as long as the cost is enough smaller than the total benefit, you can get it done. My favorite example of private production of a public good is radio broadcasts, because it's clear that that was a public good that it was impossible to produce privately, because a radio broadcast you have no control over listens to it, goes to lots and lots of people. And some unsung genius thought of the idea of producing not one public good but two. A public good with a positive value and a positive cost of production called a radio program. A public good with a negative value and a negative cost of production called an advertisement, tying the two together and giving them away. That's one example. But another example is that I write a book and I put it, or let's take my blog. All right, I don't charge for my blog. I don't even have ads on my blog. But the fact that 1,500 people a day read my blog means I'm more likely to get speaker invitations to give talks, and most of the people who invite me to talks, unlike PorcFest, pay me for doing it.
And thank you again for coming.
PorcFest is paying my expenses. They're giving me an entertaining time. I'm willing to contribute because I regard it as a useful and desirable project. So there are lots of cases in which you can give away something and get a benefit by doing so. And from a purely self-interested standpoint, forget about all of the ideology. Given that one effect of computer technology is to make it harder and harder to protect intellectual property rights, because it's easy to copy and distribute, with or without copyright law, one of the things you want to figure out in order to use that new technology is how to make money by giving things away. And that's in a sense, well, that's enough to make the point.
Yep. Thank you again for coming. We do greatly appreciate it.
In one of your books that you wrote that you have on your website, you bring up it wasn't Machinery of Freedom, but it might have been Future Imperfect, about the concept of assassination markets.
I don't think so. Assassination markets are an idea that somebody brought up, but I don't remember having ever written about them.
That's fine.
And the guy who did bring it up and wrote about it got a good deal of trouble as a result.
It might not have been assassination markets per se, but I believe it was something about in a society that involves like constant strong cryptography, the idea of
I see what you're thinking
of. The billboard with the public key of the assassination.
It was Murder Incorporated was my version.
Yes.
That's right. This was not something I was advocating.
No.
This was making the point that a world of what I called strong privacy, a world with well-distributed, commonly used public key encryption, was a world in which it was very hard to enforce many laws, including some good laws as well as some bad laws. And one example I gave was that selling the services of hitmen would become much more practical in that world.
Right. Yeah. In that kind of a scenario, because it does seem to be kind of a possible scenario and a likely one in the event of strong cryptographic privacy, could that have an impact on the ability of our resolution organizations, our hypothetical resolution organizations within this hypothetical society? Could that have an impact on their ability to bully one another, especially if we're thinking about them having some level of transparency? For example, if it's not clear who is attacking, who is murdering the higher-ups in the largest bullying dispute resolution organization, if it's not clear who is killing them off because of Murder, Inc. being some blob entity, wouldn't that be kind of a... How would they bully someone into stopping that?
It seems to me that's no different in kind from just assassinating people by hiring your own people to shoot them. That there are always going to be technologies by which people can try to use violence against each other, and Murder Incorporated is one such technology. But I don't see how it really changes the logic of the problem. And presumably, in the situation you're imagining, the higher ups are going to have guards to make sure that assassins don't get at them, whether those assassinations are hired anonymously over online or in some other way.
I suppose my only real argument about it is whether or not their inability to distinguish who acted against them would inhibit their ability to actually retaliate.
Might, but you could do that without Murder Incorporated by just hiring somebody who's not obviously connected to you.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
I rise to redress the balance here. You've been constantly talking about science fiction and getting no science fiction questions. So I have a science fiction question for you. You start off talking about David Brin, and he has a fictional version of Transparent Society, The Kiln People, that I think is much more entertaining because he's such a creative imagination and is such a tremendous predictor with this business about all these recordings going on, like in the streets of London and so on. But he gave a talk at a libertarian conference once and made it clear he was no libertarian.
Oh, he certainly isn't.
He uses the phrase "you libertarians" and all the rest. So I just wondered if you'd agreed with that.
That is, I don't have a very high opinion of Brin. I thought the first 2 chapters of that book were good, but I've interacted with him online, and he pontificates about things he knows nothing about, such as Adam Smith, and what he says isn't true, and he does not support what he says. So, no, I mean, Brin is not...
Killing People is a wonderful book, though.
What?
Killing People is a wonderful book.
Might be. I haven't read that book. But, I don't have to agree with people to think they're good writers. Niven and Pournelle are not really libertarians, though they have some libertarian instincts. Their book, Oath of Fealty, I think had some very interesting lessons for libertarians. Larry Niven has got a short story, Cloak of Anarchy, which is an anti-anarchist short story, and anarchists ought to read it and think about it. But no. As I say, I think the first 2 chapters of that book of Brin are very good. But I don't think that in general he is a very valuable thinker from what I've seen in such interactions as I've had of it. And, one prediction isn't that good. I like to claim that I predicted the business model for the web. Because I didn't do it for the web, but I did do it 40 years ago. Because in machinery, one of the arguments that was made by some of the odder left-wingers back then was that capitalism requires scarcity, and that if technological progress gives us a society of plenty, capitalism will have to create fake scarcity to survive, and that's evil. And so I said, but this is wrong, because when things get cheap enough, it pays to give them away. That you very rarely pay for water at a drinking fountain or for the use of a restroom at a gas station. And I said, suppose that technological progress made medical care so cheap in robot hospitals that it wasn't worth charging people for it. You would then have hospitals which in the inner walls were decorated with advertisements for whatever was still worth selling. And that's how they pay. Well, that's the model of the web. You give away the contents of the web page, but you put advertisements on the walls. So I'm 1 for 1 on Brin on that. No more questions. Everybody want to go home, or I got a question.
I have another question.
Good.
You did mention community, like homeowners associations and proprietary communities. What stops these from? They could be considered territorial sovereigns because their whole existence is based on control of a territorial area. And then adding things in to more deeds, house deeds, when you transfer ownership, the new owner has to keep the paint white or something like that. Combining these concepts, if these communities decide to say, hey, we want to protect ourselves from bigger threats like these other states, and they federate, and then, we get
could happen.
The U.S. government again.
Could happen. Could happen.
Okay.
I'm not predicting that the world's going to go well.
Okay.
So comment about your definition of government. I noticed that there's no requirement of monopoly there. So on your definition, there could be 6 governments in the same place. Is there something to say about...
There are. In this very place that we are in at the moment, there are probably at least 3 governments. Well, at least 2. Technically speaking, local governments in the U.S. are agencies of the state government, but state governments in the U.S. are not subsidiaries of the federal government. They're legally independent. They have certain legal relations to the federal government, but there are 2 different governments that are that are agencies of legitimized coercion in this very spot.
Okay. Well, so it sounds like there could be 2 governments with exactly the same jurisdiction. It also kind of sounded like, well, there could be...
There could be. There have been. Think about the church and state in medieval Europe.
Yeah.
It sounds like... You could certainly have a situation where there are 2 separate organizations, and one of them is the agency of legitimized coercion with regard to one set of issues, and the other one is the agency of legitimized coercion with a different set of issues. That's a possible equilibrium. Yeah.
But then it seems like it doesn't even have to be a different set of issues. Also, I mean, it also seems like there could be someone who we would normally call a private individual who, on your definition, would be a government. So, like if my wife violates my rights, I just let it go.
How about
then she
Superman?
becomes a government.
Suppose we have the present situation plus Superman exists.
Yeah.
And everybody recognizes that given how powerful Superman is, it just isn't worth the trouble of trying to fight him or sue him.
Yeah.
So you could then have a case where when Superman violates your rights,
Right.
you pass by just like the government does. So that'd be logically possible, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, just wondering if there's more to say about why you shouldn't include the element of monopoly in the definition.
Because historically it isn't true. Because you've had things that look an awful lot like governments which didn't claim such a monopoly.
Well, let's just say, I think most people wouldn't describe Superman as being government in that situation.
How about,
But
how about the Catholic Church and the royal authority in medieval Europe? Looks more like it.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Both of which claim temporal authority, either at times could execute you.
Okay. Well, anyway, that's all I have to say.
Actually, I don't think the Catholic Church could. The church law did not have capital punishment, and I think in order to execute somebody, they have to hand them over to the temporal authorities.
But the local governments were in many cases, like in Spain and in portions of Italy, bullied into handing over the machinery to the Inquisition, which was a direct portion of the Vatican hierarchy.
But I think it was the actual local government that had to execute it. No,
That might be the case, but churchmen were doing the torturing, and that is probably a rights violation, I think. And it was certainly
yeah, it was capital punishment I was talking about.
Understood, but I mean, but at the very least, there seem to be things that are doing violent rights violations simultaneously.
Yeah, sure.
Comment, something I might venture to the definition of a government, which was discussed earlier. As opposed in a distinction between like a private property owner, a landlord, whatever what have you, they use their control over their property and the coercion they exercise on the people within it as it's an end in itself, like it's their property. Whereas a government, they use, or at least what we call a state in modern times, it's a justification. Their power is to the end of democracy. Their power is to the end of liberty or whatever. It's an ideological thing.
I guess I'm not sure that would be true of all historical governments. They're going to have lots of different reasons. But I wouldn't think of a property owner who claims the right to expel you from his property as engaged in legitimized coercion, because your view is that expelling people from private property is something people are entitled to do. You don't think of that as a rights violation.
Right, but that ideology that he has, like, it is his, he doesn't need a reason why he expels you. He can expel you if he wants to, whereas a state...
But it seems to me that many states would say that the ultimate reason we can do this to you is because we're the ruler and we're entitled to do it to you.
Right, but as that's going out of style.
Lots of different governments in the world, historically.
Hi there. Had a question for you, maybe a little bit of an odd one, and I don't say this to stroke your ego, although I appreciate the talk and it was very entertaining, but it may come off that way. But I'm curious why you think your father didn't embrace anarchy and you did. Because for what it's worth, I'll give you the punchline. I think you're right, but I'm just curious. I mean, both very smart people.
Let me see if I can give as good an answer as I can. I think the difference between our views was that I thought the system I described probably would work but might not, and he thought it might work but probably wouldn't. And we don't have very rigorous arguments for showing what would work, as I hope I've demonstrated in discussing the various problems tonight. But the other difference was that we had different interests. That he was really interested in the question of, in the world as it is, in the context of the next few decades, how can we make the world better? And I was more interested in the theoretical question, how could you construct as good a human society as one can imagine having? And so that I think was more nearly a difference in what questions we wanted to answer than it was a difference in beliefs.
Thank you.
Thank you again for taking the time. You mentioned that you had problems with a proof of what is evil. I'm curious if you've had a chance to look at Stefan Molyneux's book, Universally Preferable Behavior, A Rational Proof of Secular Ethics.
No,
okay.
But I've looked at various arguments on this subject.
Okay.
Hi, just to follow up on a question that I raised earlier, two more sort of observations. One is we already live in a world in which people can join various associations independent of the sovereign territorial government, various types of associations. And even religious organizations could be considered sort of transnational, rights-defining organizations. And so I guess the question that goes along with it, is it possible that it's sort of an empirical question of whether it is sort of economically more viable in the long term to have a territorial rights enforcement agency or to have a group of competing associations, and perhaps economically it is better for people to move from one territorial organization to another as the best form of competition, and perhaps the reason that the sort of system you propose hasn't come into being is because economically it's not viable in the long term to do so.
Could be. The problem is that I don't think there is any mechanism that automatically generates efficient political institutions. There's something that sometimes is referred to as the Whig theory of history, which is the idea that history is sort of a steady progress to better and better institutions. And I just don't see any evidence to support it. That on the whole, I think absolute monarchy was probably a step down from feudalism, not a step up. I think communism was clearly a step down from Tsarist Russia. Nazism was a step down from Bismarck, not a step up. So it doesn't seem to me that there's any mechanism that there's a mechanism in a competitive market which tells you if there's a better way of producing a product, it'll tend to develop. I don't see an equivalent mechanism historically for political institutions, so therefore I don't think the fact that you've ended up with a certain outcome tells us it's economically efficient. It tells us it's what you get, and it's an interesting question why, and I have thoughts on that, but I don't think it means that it wouldn't be better to have some other one.
So you kind of mentioned this earlier, but can you talk more about anarchism and national defense?
And national defense. Yeah. I can. Let me see how much time I have. 15 minutes. All right. Let me describe what will be another chapter when I do the third edition of Machinery of Freedom, because I've got some ideas on national defense which come out of a mix of weird subjects, one of them being a Rudyard Kipling short story, one of them being things like paintball and the Society for Creative Anachronism, and one of them being open source software. And one of them being the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. And let me start with the Second Amendment and with my theory of what the Second Amendment was about. As I see it, people in the 18th century were worried about the following problem. It was clear on the evidence that professional armies beat amateur armies. And it was also clear that professional armies were dangerous. And the clearest evidence for this was in the 17th century, when, as you may know, there were two English civil wars. The first English Civil War was basically Parliament against the king, and they won. And they won through a man called Oliver Cromwell and a military force he commanded called the New Model Army. The Second Civil War was Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army against everybody else, and he won, with the result that Cromwell was military dictator of England for the rest of his life. He was one of the better rulers England has had, I should say. He was quite a competent fellow, but nonetheless it was a disturbing pattern of events. And so how do you solve this problem? How do you defend yourself without a professional army? And if you have a professional army, how do you keep it from taking over? And I think the Second Amendment answer is you have a very small professional army and a very large amateur militia. And so if you're invaded, the professional army provides sort of the elite and the coordination, and the militia is pretty bad, but there are a lot of them, and if the professional army tries to take over, the militia outnumbers them 100 to 1. So my current model for the anarcho-capitalist, I'll skip the Kipling short story, which is called The Army of a Dream, and which I recommend to you, is a society where there are a lot of people who do military training for the fun of it. And that's going to include people who do paintball, Society for Creative Anachronism. In another month, I will be watching a medieval battle with 1,000 people on a side. It includes people who do war games of various sorts and so forth. So you have lots of people for some mix of cultural, ideological, and fun reasons who choose to train themselves militarily. You then have a small elite of professional soldiers who are paid by charity. In peacetime, the professional soldiers provide some coordination. They run war games for the hobbyists. They make sure that their radios can talk to each other. If there's a war, they're the elite of the army, and then the, what's the right term for the kind of soldiers who get expended, unfortunately? What? Grunts. The grunts, the red shirts, are the militia. And I think you could have a workable compromise along those lines. So that, I don't think there's a written version of that up on my webpage yet, but at some point there will be, because it's going to be part of the 3rd edition. The Kipling story is basically describing an imaginary future England in which cricket and football have been replaced by war games. And the result is that you've got something like the Swiss system with the whole adult male population trained soldiers, but they're doing it for some mix of fun and social pressure rather than with some government support. I mean, Kipling was not an anarchist, although he did write a very good anarchist poem, which I will recite at some point during this next few days, I expect. But anyway, that's the set of ideas along those lines.
David Friedman! Just want to say it's such a pleasure to have him here. Very easy to work with. He didn't have to be, but he was, and it has been. And thank you, and hope you all very much enjoyed the show.
Songs as I write you this letter, days past and days yet to come, and the message of freedom, the message of freedom. I stand at the edge of the pages of history and lessons unlearned. It feels like these pages are remaining unturned, but boys, it's no mystery. Children, I'm sorry to leave you this world in a state of disaster. It was given to me in a